Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to Office Hours with Michael Kitces. So for today's episode, as you can see, I'm not quite in my usual location here. I'm in beautiful Sydney, Australia. You can see the Sydney Opera House right there behind me, as well as the financial central business district for Sydney. So I'm here in Australia talking to financial advisors today, and actually going to be, this is part of an ongoing trip I've had. I was in India, in Mumbai, the beginning of this week, talking to financial advisors there as well. And the theme of all of the talks I've been giving over the past week as I go to different countries has been very consistent. It's all about the phenomenon of what's happening globally as financial advisors adopt the fiduciary movement around the world. So, when we look in the U.S., we've had all this discussion and debate around the fiduciary duty and the Department of Labor's actions, but the truth is that the fiduciary shift is not in any way at all unique to the U.S. In fact, we actually lag in this manner. So when I look at India, they were one of the first that started this process. India banned upfront commissions all the way back in 2009 on open-ended mutual funds and forced distributors to only pay ongoing trails and a small back-end load if people liquidated their funds quickly. Australia here created what they call their Future of Financial Advice, or FOFA, reforms in 2012 that ultimately led to a ban on investment commissions. The United Kingdom in 2013 had what they called their Retail Distribution Review, or RDR, which ultimately led to a ban of investment commissions and the rise of financial advisors in the UK. The Netherlands did the same thing in 2013, banning investment commissions. And so all of these countries around the world have been putting through bans on investment commissions and implementations of fiduciary duty, best interest standards. Different countries use different languages, but all built around this idea that advisors who give advice shouldn't be getting paid commissions from fund companies to distribute products. They should be getting paid compensation directly from their clients for their advice to create the necessary objectivity that comes when you get paid by a client and not paid by a company to distribute their products. And it's leading to a very common set of shifts that happen in the aftermath around the world. Almost every country that implements a fiduciary ban sees a fairly immediate drop in the number of financial advisors that are there. Seems to vary by country, but often numbers like 10 to 20% or so seem to leave the business. But the interesting phenomenon I find when I talk to advisors on the ground in every single one of these countries is that the advisors who are leaving when a fiduciary rule comes and a commission ban comes is the same almost every time. The people who leave are the ones who wrote financial advisor on their business card, but they weren't really financial advisors. They were product salespeople. All they did is sell things to as many people as they could and get paid as much in commissions as they could. It's not a huge portion of the industry, but it's a good 10 or 20 or 30% of the industry. And as soon as commission bans come through and they say, well, you can't get paid high commissions anymore, you can only get paid to actually do the work of giving someone advice and justifying your value based on the quality of your advice, they say, forget it. I'm going to go and do something else instead. I'll sell something in some other industry that's easier to sell and pays me more quickly. And so the shift that we really begin to see as these countries go through a transition is this recognition that in most countries around the world, lots of people write financial advisor on their business card. Not all of them necessarily have the training, competency, education, or ability to actually get paid to give advice. And so once you eliminate commissions and you require a fiduciary duty in place, it becomes very noticeable who's actually able to give advice and not. It's kind of like the old Buffett saying, once the tide goes out, you see who's been swimming without the shorts on. Very similar phenomenon seem to happen as commission bans and fiduciary rules come in place around the world. Now, one of the things I want to touch on is why this seems to be happening globally. I mean, it's a very fascinating thing to me when you recognize that in the span of less than a decade, commission bans or fiduciary rules are not only getting proposed in the U.S., but have happened in Australia, the U.K., India, the Netherlands. Canada is now working on a lightweight version called CRM2. South Africa even has been putting through a version of a fiduciary rule. This is an incredibly global phenomenon. Virtually every country that has a well-established base of financial advisors is going through a very comparable set of reforms. And ironically, in the U.S., we actually have one of the mildest versions because we're not banning investment commissions. We're simply elevating some of the accountability standards around fiduciary. Most other countries completely banned commissions. Australia was here, interesting, a couple of years ago. Back in, I think it was 2015, we kicked off the debate in the U.S. under FINRA about whether brokers who change broker-dealers should be required to disclose to their clients the fact that they got paid money to switch platforms. In Australia, they just banned all recruiting compensation for changing platforms. Right? Like, we couldn't even decide whether it should be disclosed. Australia banned it. So our version of fiduciary rules has actually been relatively mild compared to what we're seeing around the globe. But the reason why it's happening so consistently around the globe, I think, is actually a kind of an indirect byproduct of the rise of technology and actually the internet over the past 20 years that I still don't think has been fully appreciated for how much technology completely changed the nature of being a financial advisor. Because if I dial the clock back to the 1980s and the 1990s, if you wanted to get access to investment products, you had to go through a financial advisor that sold mutual funds. Around most countries around the world, there were very, very few options for direct-to-consumer mutual funds. A couple of companies did it as their special thing that they did. Vanguard, notably in the U.S. T. Rowe Price had a fairly hefty direct-to-consumer distribution. But it was a fun company strategy. You might say, hey, we're going to try to work around advisors and spend tons of money going directly to consumers. But they were the exception to the rule. Most fund companies around the world distributed through financial advisors who they paid as salespeople, paid them commissions to sell their funds. Then the internet showed up. And by the early 2000s, two things started happening at the same time. One, there was a huge increase in the number of fund companies that started going direct to consumer because they said, oh, this is awesome. We just make a website and then consumers can come to us directly and buy our products. It's much easier to do direct to consumer distribution. The second phenomenon that happened was the rise of online brokerage platforms. So in the U.S., this would be E-Trade, Schwab.com, the early versions of TD Ameritrade Online. And all of a sudden, consumers that wanted to buy mutual funds could just go online and buy it themselves. And since they were buying it themselves, they bought a no-load, a no-commission version of the fund. And we started running these in parallel. Commission-based funds sold by advisors, no-load funds sold directly to consumers through online brokerage platforms. And what's happened is over 15 years of that phenomenon, a growing number of consumers just start saying, why would I pay you, a financial advisor, just to pick a mutual fund when I can look a fund up online through, Kiplinger magazine or Money magazine or research on Morningstar or Yahoo Finance? If you're going to do something for me as an advisor, you got to do something above and beyond just a mutual fund. Like, give me some actual advice about how to allocate my portfolio or how to manage my financial life. And so the shift that's happened in almost every country around the world is technology has essentially eliminated the need for advisors just to sell mutual funds, is that advisors had to start giving advice, actually really becoming financial advisors, was written on their business card, and not just trying to sell mutual funds. But as advisors began to actually give advice, the regulatory conflicts emerged. And I think that's why we're seeing this fiduciary phenomenon around the world over the past decade, because it's only the past decade that the majority of advisors who write financial advisor on their business card are actually in the business of giving advice. And as soon as advisors start actually focusing on giving advice, it quickly becomes obvious to regulators in every country around the world that it's not a good thing when people who are supposed to give objective advice are getting compensated primarily by commissions from fund companies. Not that consumers shouldn't necessarily invest in mutual funds. If they're good funds and valuable, that's great. But let the advisor pick them objectively after being compensated by the client, not because they were compensated directly from the fund company. And so this ongoing shift of advisors moving out of I sell products and into I created asset allocated portfolios, manage them, and give you ongoing advice is creating this ongoing shift of advisors actually becoming advisors and regulators saying, well, if you're really going to be an advisor, then we're going to regulate you that way. Which means that fiduciary duty starts coming up in Australia, in the UK, in India, one after the other around the world as this phenomenon shifts. Now, the reason why this is interesting to me, beyond just the nature of the global phenomenon, is that I think there's a lot of trends that we're likely to see emerging and continuing to emerge from here. Because the problem we really have, and I think this is true in the U.S. as well as other countries around the world, is that so much of the ecosystem that supports financial advisors is still, at the end of the day, built primarily around what we do up front to get a client, Because if you were paid a commission for a mutual fund, all you really cared about at the end of the day was getting someone to sign and do business. Once we're in the ongoing advice business, we have to actually get good at ongoing advice. One of the common comparisons that's made between commissions and fees is that over the long run, it's actually quite possible you'll pay more in fees than you will in commissions. Or if I think the simplified example of a 5% commission mutual fund up front or a 1% AUM fee, after 5 years, I will have paid 1% fees. That adds up to the same thing as the 5% commission. And over 10 years, I'll actually have paid 1% fees, which is more than the 5% commission as long as no one else had come in and sold a new 5% commission fund to replace the first one. If at least you buy and hold both, you may actually end up paying more in the fees than you do in the commissions. But here's the distinction. If I sell a 5% commission fund, I only get paid once up front. All I got to do is convince someone once to do business with me, and I get paid. And it frankly doesn't even really matter if I call them again after that. I might continue to stay in touch with them only because I want more commission opportunities. But there's no real obligation for in-depth ongoing advice services because I already got paid. If I'm going to get paid 1% a year over the next 5 years because I want to add up to the same thing as the commission, I have to justify my value, my reason for existence, what I do to earn my fees every single year on an ongoing basis. And that pressure to justify ongoing value, I think, is creating all sorts of new pressures and challenges on us as financial advisors, not only to just figure out how to explain ongoing value that we provide, but to actually be able to deliver it and have the technology to help. And so we see all these gaps to me in the current landscape. One of the biggest ones that frustrates me these days is our financial planning software is built so focused on doing an upfront financial plan for a client and very, very little about how to help clients on an ongoing basis thereafter, right? Why don't we have goal tracking where we can show how a client has progressed through 7 years of a relationship with us? Hey, you started here, and the financial planning software automatically tracks, then you were here, then you were here, then you were here, and the client can see their sense of progression over time by working with us, maybe even showing milestones of significant accomplishments that we've achieved along the way. The planning software should automate all of the monitoring. We see only a few planning softwares still that automate account aggregation to pull it into financial planning software so that I can just log into the software anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to see what's actually going on with my financial plan on an ongoing basis. Yet if my value is primarily what I'm going to do for my clients in years 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and beyond, frankly, the bulk of what we do in our financial planning software should be what comes after the initial plan, not up front. One of the other interesting phenomena that we're seeing very much here now, I'm finding in Australia and the UK, starting in India, and certainly I think that we've actually seen in the US, is once advisors start getting paid for advice and not necessarily getting paid by fund distributors, it starts raising questions about why am I even affiliated with this fund company, broker, dealer, bank, whatever the financial institution is, because it varies a little country by country, but all of them have these large vertically integrated asset management distribution divisions. But when the advisors start just getting paid fees for their advice, they start saying, well, why am I associated with this big company that takes a huge portion of my compensation? Why don't I just go independent and get paid for the advice directly myself? So in the U.S., we see the rise of the RIA movement. When I was speaking in India earlier this week, I was speaking for a company called iFast. For U.S. advisors, you can think of iFast as the first RIA custodian. India just created fiduciary RIAs a few years ago. iFast is the first custodian that's building for them, doing what in the U.S. we would think of simple things, but in India is rather new, like iFast is the only platform in India where, as an RIA, you can actually bill and sweep your fees from investment accounts. No other provider can do that yet because the RIA movement is that new in India. Over 1 billion people, a few hundred RIAs, one platform. Tremendous opportunity for them. But the shift that we're seeing from countries around the world is as advisors start getting paid fees and not necessarily commissions for investment distribution, they begin shifting more independent. And the more that they go independent, the more they demand technology to support them. And the more technology that gets created, the easier it is to be independent and the more firms there are that go independent. One of the biggest conversations I've been having with a lot of the companies here in Australia lately is you'd better be ready for an exodus of advisors that are pushing towards independence, because that's what we see in almost every country around the world. The UK, there's already been a dramatic shift towards advisors going independent. And so be aware that these kinds of ongoing shifts are happening around the world. And for those of us that are advisors in the U.S., to just understand that the fiduciary phenomenon is not just some peculiar thing that's cropped up in the U.S., some esoteric debate that's happening between broker-dealers and RIAs or between the DOL and the SEC. This is a global phenomenon driven by the fundamental fact that financial advisors around the world are shifting from primarily being in the business of selling insurance and investment products to actually being in the business of giving advice, because the technology is actually making it easier and easier for consumers to buy their products directly, which means advisors have to do something more on top, whether that's ongoing investment management and portfolio monitoring, asset allocated portfolios, broader financial planning, specialization, niches. All of these things are what come as advisors try to demonstrate their ongoing value and differentiate themselves in a world where it's really, really not actually about the products anymore. Not that clients don't need to be invested and that we won't still have a role in seeing where the dollars go, but it's not what we're paid for anymore, and that's what's driving this global fiduciary phenomenon. So I hope that's a little bit interesting as some food for thought about what's happening around the world, and that you've enjoyed a little bit of the Sydney morning sunrise going on behind me with the Opera House in the Financial District here. This is Office Hours with Michael Kitces, normally 1 p.m. East Coast time on Tuesdays. I missed that by a little bit here since the time zones didn't quite line up a little, but thanks for hanging out and joining me, everyone, and have a great day.